Good morning, photographers, and welcome to this little video. This is to walk you through this slideshow about camera functions and give you a quick overview of how it works, um, and get you moving from auto mode on the camera to more creative controls, like controlling the aperture, shutter, and ISO. Here goes. All right, when you have a DSLR camera, there's a mode dial that looks something like this, and you can see here on the top, there's M for manual, A for aperture. On this camera, it's S for shutter. On our cameras, it says T or TV, AV, and that's a portrait mode or preset. And we won't be using that. Okay, so you want to use aperture, AV, TV, or manual, which is having control over all aspects of the camera. I know this slide says to shoot in RAW, but that's when we're in the classroom and have faster computers to process those photos. But RAW files for Google Drive and for moving things over the internet are too big. So I recommend you guys set the camera to JPEG, which was in the other video that I made for you, how to set that up like that. Okay, so here we go. To understand how to use a camera, it's important just to know its anatomy. It's kind of like an eyeball. When we see things in the world, what's happening is we have this device in our heads that absorb light. When we see objects, we're actually seeing the light coming off of the objects, and it goes into our eye. And there's a sensor in the back of our eye called the retina, way back here, and it creates an upside down image in our eyeball, and then our brain processes it and makes us think we see it right side up. And in the 1800s, when they're discovering how eyeballs work, they created cameras to try to do this as well. Okay, and so if you study this picture a little bit, when we blink, think about when we blink, your eyelids are like a little door, right? To allow light in, and when it gets too bright, we close our eyes. That's kind of like the shutter. It's a shutter door inside of a camera, okay? The pupil and iris, the pupil is the black part of your eyeball, and the iris is the color part. And when it gets really bright out, our pupil seems to get smaller, but it's really the iris. If you look here, the iris right here is actually shrinking to make the hole smaller, to let less light in to the camera. Okay, and so you have a size of hole when it's dark, like inside of a room or at night. That was kind of obvious, right? Your pupils will open up and dilate. Okay, but it's really the iris that's moving, and the pupil, you can see more of it. The black part grows when it's darker. Therefore, the hole is larger to let more light into your eyeball. And same over here. It's the aperture. Aperture is a fancy word that means hole. Okay, and letting more light into the camera or into your eyeball. And in the eyeball, the light goes through the doors, through your eyelids, through the iris, through the pupil, and hits the retina. That's the sensor. That's where the image lands. And in a camera, it's your film, or in a digital camera, we now have a sensor. And the sensor absorbs the light. Okay, so let that sink in for a little bit, and let's move on. Okay, so here is the other way to look at it. I just described three controls, three things that control how much light goes into your camera. It is the shutter, the door, like our eyelids. Right? There's an aperture, the hole, and then there's the ISO. It's an acronym, means International Standards Organization, but one way to think of it is your internal sensory organ of the camera. It's how sensitive it is to light. The more sensitive it is, the more light will be in your picture, and the less sensitive, the less light. Okay, and these three controls we have in a camera in order to control light. That's why this picture of the sun is sort of inside there. We use these three controllers to control not only the amount of light in the camera, but each control has a creative side to it and creates different results in your picture aside from the amount of light, right? So with shutter speed, you can control how much motion blur there is. If you have somebody running by and you're shooting them, you can have them super sharp and see their shoelaces, or you can have like a speed blur, and you would control that with your shutter. Aperture it's called depth of field that you have control over, and that means how much of the total picture is in focus. And there's other tutorials in this website for you guys to see these controls in more detail and learn how to use them. Okay, this is just an overview right now. But overall, the aperture, the whole, it creates background blur or background sharpness. That's what depth of field is referring to. Okay, and then ISO is referring to the sensitivity, right? And when it's highly sensitive, you will get what's called noise in digital photography or grain in film photography. It's considered a bad thing in digital photography to have a high ISO and get a bunch of dots, those really weird colored dots in your nighttime pictures. But if you turn them black and white, sometimes that looks like grain, and that's kind of considered beautiful to a lot of black and white photographers. All right, but in general, you want to set your ISO really low. So here's an example of the aperture. The aperture is actually in the lens. It's good to know that, because when you change lenses, you change your aperture options. But it's these blades inside that when you change the F number, it's called, that hole gets bigger or smaller. And here is a slide to show that. So don't get too overwhelmed by the technical language on here. Basically, the lower the F number, the bigger the hole, and the higher the smaller. Okay, so this will let less light in. You know, a hole that is smaller lets less light in, and a hole that's bigger, open your eyes real big, more light might get in. Not really true. It matters what your pupil's doing. Okay, but learning to change the F number will give you the creative option, give you the creative option of how much background blur you have in your shots. So those of you who want to shoot like flower pictures fairly close up and you want everything else to be blurry, you'll want to use a low F number. Okay, it's called opening up the camera. If a big landscape picture, you want things far away to be pretty sharp and things that are really close to also be sharp, you'll want to use a higher number, F16, F20, whatever, 22, whatever. Okay. Now, this is a more advanced information that you'll want to know down the line, but we measure the amount of light getting into a camera in a term called stops, f-stops. And certain aperture numbers represent a whole stop, which means when you move from f6, f5.6 to f4, that's called one stop, you're doubling or times two the amount of light getting into the camera. And if you move down, called stopping down, from f2.8 as an example here to 4, that represents half as much light getting in the camera. You don't have to know that right now, but when you hear the word stop or stopping down or f-stops, it's referring to that measurement of light. Okay, shutters. All right, the shutter is the door. It controls how long the camera is taking the picture. Pictures are measured in split seconds, in fractions of a second, but it is possible to set it to be long. Like a whole second is a very long time in photography. And the longer the door is open, the more light is flooding into the camera. Okay, so on this scale here, one thing I like to tell students is that a slow shutter speed, where you're going to get a lot of motion blur, kind of begins at about 1/60th of a second in most sort of daylight situations or in a room perhaps. But you got to play with it. There's so many factors in photography and light that there's always exceptions to the rules that we learn. So that's considered a slow shutter speed. And if you want to freeze motion in most situations, like outdoor, somebody running by, you'll probably need to get it up to at least 1/300th of a second. Okay, 1/400th of a second. But there's other factors that contribute to what number is the magic number for freezing motion, like the lens and how zoomed in you are and other things like that. So just a little guideline: 1/60th slow, 1/300th, 1/400th of a second is the beginning of the fast shutter speeds to freeze motion. Okay, and the last control is the sensitivity. This one, like I said, the lower the ISO is generally considered the better quality of photo, the better density that you're going to get in a photo. Okay, that's what that says right here in this paragraph. But when you raise the ISO, you'll get more light into a picture. Like when you're indoors, you'll need to raise the ISO, but to just get a good balanced exposure. But you might start getting noise or getting those little dots that are not really in the scene. It's just your sensors. What happens is it gets so sensitive that it's creating its own sort of information, creating imaginary pixels and little dots of light. Okay. Now this is a great graphic. If you're able to print it, put it in your sketchbook, it'd be great. But check this out. This is showing how F numbers work. Okay, the higher the number, the smaller the hole. This one's showing you how at what shutter speed you'll get motion blur. So down these lower shutter speed, half a second. Okay, 1/8 of a second, you're going to get a lot of motion blur. And here it is, about 250 to 300 starts getting sharper, right? Okay, and this is what I'm talking about with grain or noise. The higher the ISO, the more grainy or noisy it will get. And the lower, the more dense, the more clear and not noisy it will be. Okay, and that's the end of the slideshow. That's the overview of the controls. Look at the other slideshows for how to use them creatively.